Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. I have the pleasure of Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma's company today, and we are going to discuss about the visit of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Justin Welby, to India. He's supposed to have arrived today in India, and he's going to visit some cities, including Amritsar. Pandit Satish Kumarji, welcome to PGurus channel.
Pranam, namaskar, Shri Iyerji. It's a pleasure to be on your channel again, and especially to talk about something which is so important.
So, you knew of this impending visit a few weeks ago, and you wrote to the Archbishop because you saw that in Canada, the Anglican Church head issued an unconditional apology for all the colonialistic activities that the British carried out over the period of many, many years. So with that, keeping that in mind, you wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Did you hear from him, sir?
Yes, I received an acknowledgement to the letter and a promise of a communication, but it's been several weeks now and nothing has been received, so we've decided to publish the letter and make it public knowledge. You've just mentioned the letter of apology, which was articulated over in Canada. For anybody who is interested in inquiring further, all they need to do is Google apology Anglican Canada, and they'll get a lovely YouTube video which really explains in detail how atrocious the actions were, how appalling they were, and indeed how comprehensive the apology that the Anglican Church of Canada have given.
Wow, that is enlightening, and I'm hoping that the Archbishop would do the same when he's visiting India. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wouldn't hold your breath waiting if I were you, unless, of course, you're an expert in pranayama or something. I think the prospects are not very, very favorable for doing that. In fact, the nature of the letter that I wrote was really to invite a conversation which could lead towards a full and frank apology. You see, if you understand the extent of the apology of what was that was articulated in Canada, then you will understand that what was being done in Canada is exactly the same as what was being done by Archbishop Welby's church in Africa and in India at exactly the same time. And so if they're acknowledging that the ideology which was fueling them to perform these terrible acts, kidnapping indigenous children, trying to destroy their culture, deliberately demonizing their ancestral practices, all of those things are thoroughly and openly accepted as having been done, then you have to accept that they were doing the same thing in every single area of the colonies. So it's certainly due, and the intention of my letter was to raise this with the Archbishop so that we could have a conversation prior to him going to India, and then in India perhaps maximizing the opportunity of starting this dialogue and saying there is an issue here which is the people of India of today and the people of England of today. If we can reconcile and overcome this historical issue, then perhaps we can find chart a nice way forward for the two communities to proceed.
Now, that brings up an interesting point. So they have not responded back. I mean, they did not invite you for a dialogue. Now, he's already here, but there is a way that we can reach out to him, and that is through this video. So if, assuming that you were sitting in front of the Archbishop and not me, what would you like to tell him?
Well, let's take one step back. If I had met him, these are the sort of things that I would have said to him. I would have said to him that there was a time when the British occupied India. And so if we use the language of the BBC, we would refer to India not as a colony, we would refer to it as British occupied India. Okay?
That's right, that's right.
So at the time when the British occupied India, there was an attitude that the great white man was the great white savior.
Yes.
And that just because of their color, because of their culture, because of their language, because of who they were supremacists on all of those areas, and therefore they crushed the Indian people and the Indian society. Now, what we don't want is a repeat of the same optics. I'm sure you can remember when a viceroy would land and come off a steamship at the gates of to India, the gateway to India in Mumbai. He would have a Mem Saab on his arm, and he would be treated like the Gora Saab who has just emerged from some incredible place across the waters, and they were treated almost like gods. The Indian tradition of Atithi Devo Bhava is something that they had no idea what it meant, but they actually assumed that it meant that they could come and take whatever they wished. So what we mustn't have is the Archbishop landing in India and following that same mold, especially now since most of the world is beginning to understand that what was done by the Anglicans when they last came to India in that manner was a horrific act of cultural and spiritual and physical genocide in many spaces. So that would be the first thing. I'd say, please don't traipse around as though you're better than everybody else. It's inappropriate, and I'm sure it will cause difficulties.
Just to put the thing in the right perspective, about 25,000 white men or Britishers were ruling a population of 25 crores. And if you read the literature between 1850 and 1900 about what these officers used to write about India, it's extremely condescending, extremely derogatory of the local practices and customs, and an air of superiority that was cultivated. I mean, it has to be seen to be believed as to the hubris and the arrogance that these officers showed when they wrote to each other or wrote back home. We should also remember that other than Australia, a lot of high school dropouts found their way to India. At the age of 17, somebody became a collector of a huge mass of area, and this collector would dispense not just the administration but also justice. And he would have like 2 or 3 retinues where people would go and pitch camp, and he would go from place to place to place to place, dispensing arbitrary justice. Think about it. A 17-year-old guy, how much of wisdom he's going to have, how much of knowledge of the local customs he's going to have, and yet he would sit in judgment over some very critical land assignment. And through all this stuff, we know that the Zamindari Act was passed, where after 1857, the British chose some of the most rowdiest ruffians of the area, and they took the land of the rich farmers, and they just grabbed it from their hand and gave it to these guys and said, look, we expect so much money from you. How you collect it, how much more you collect it is no concern of ours, and just go about doing this. So to those of us who are descendants of Zamindari system, guys, we can't really speak much about our ancestors. These were some of the most loathsome people.
Cruelest of times. It was the cruelest of times.
Yes.
And one thing which is very conveniently forgotten and overlooked, and I suspect deliberately, is that all of the Britishers who we call the colonialists, who we call Britishers, they came and they behaved in a manner which had the approval of the Church of England.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
There is absolutely no record of anybody from the church saying, "Oh, these are terrible things. You mustn't do this." When the Sikhs were tied to the front of cannons and blown apart by British soldiers giving orders to that effect, it was with the sanction of the church. The church never criticized it, and so as an institution, there is definitely an apology due and a reconciliation to be done. Now, you mentioned arrogance. And it's just reminded me that the opening phrase of that apology starts with spiritual arrogance. If you would bear with me while I just perhaps pull out 1 or 2 sentences.
Absolutely, absolutely. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
So in 1993, an apology was given to the indigenous people of Canada first, and nothing much was actually done. It was not acted upon. And so what then happened is 15 years later, it was commemorated, and then only last month, a month or 2 ago, the current primate of the Anglican Church of Canada then decided that this needed to be acted upon. And it wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. It was because the indigenous people of Canada had managed to muster enough strength and recover from the atrocities inflicted upon them that they were now beginning to demand that the atrocities be at least recognized. And so the manner in which the apology starts. It starts off as it says, "We apologize for our cultural and spiritual arrogance that has caused harm to your peoples." Right? He expressed his remorse that we tried to remake you in our own image. He goes on, "I offer this apology for our cultural and spiritual arrogance towards all indigenous peoples and the harm we inflicted upon you." And remember, these were supposedly representatives of God who were taking children away from their parents and putting them into concentration camps, which they called residential schools, where basically all trace of their culture was driven out of them. And they tried to make them in basically brown Christian people. He continues in this. He says, "We confess our sin in not acknowledging that your people lived here for thousands of years and that you had a spiritual relationship with the Creator." As I go through this, it'd be really worth substituting the word Indian in the appropriate places and comparing the Indian experience. And then I think the reason for myself asking this apology will become very, very much more real. You know, we ignored that you had a spiritual relationship with the Creator and the land. We did not care enough to learn about your spirituality and how it has always infused your relationships and family. We confess the sin of our arrogance in dismissing indigenous spiritualities. I confess our sin in multiple acts of preventing you from pursuing your own spiritual practices. I confess our sin in declaring your teachings of medicine to be pagan and primitive. I confess our sin in robbing your children and your youth of the opportunity to know their spiritual ancestry and the great wealth of its wisdom and guidance. So these are just small snippets out of the very full apology that was given over in Canada. And I'm absolutely confident, and the evidence supports it, that the exact same apology is certainly due from the Church of England, i.e. through Justin Welby, the current Archbishop, to the people of India. There is no difference between the two. And so this was the nature of my inquiry and a request that it is time that we actually explore these issues and let's start to reconcile.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would just go ahead and say that the Archbishop has part of his work done already, and he can use what we can call as cut and paste, copy paste, and do the necessary modifications, add a few more things, because India, after all, was a vast civilization, a very old civilization, a very distinguished civilization, and there was a lot more damage and destruction that was wrought upon it, especially Macaulay for one that I can think of. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not really trying to go and play victim here. We're just stating the facts. I don't want the viewers, to think that, oh, now is the opportunity to vent. No, that's not the fact. That's not the truth. What we're trying to say is lay before the audience the facts of the matter. There's so much that has happened, and a simple, heartfelt apology would go a long way to heal the long-lasting wounds and move forward. But I think, in my opinion, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, in my opinion, the Archbishop should also make a mention that forthwith he's going to stop any conversion attempts on part of the Church of England in India. I mean, this is also a must. It's not just the fact that you apologize for your past sins, but there is a present activity that is going on, and that has to stop forthwith too. What are your thoughts about it?
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. You see, at the moment, the whole religious interfaith dialogue is framed by institutions which were formed in colonial times. And if we look back at the level of social evolution of the people who came to India at that time, they were barbarians. The actions that were promoted by this Church of England were barbaric according to the standards of the civilization that they had come to. And yet, those institutions are still promulgating the same ideologies. And so if we accept that the apology is valid, the actions that the apology covers, they really should not be allowed to continue. So you're completely correct. If there is a missionary out there who has been sent with the same message of white Christian supremacy to go and save the souls of heathens, that missionary, I would suggest, should, one, be recalled, but the Indian government should certainly, on the basis of that apology, be able to say, we're sorry your visa is suspended. And as far as any other missionary activity is concerned, those missionary visa applications should be denied. In fact, I would get rid of the missionary visa in its entirety. England doesn't have a missionary visa. You know, it's a nonsense. You can have a religious teacher, but a missionary comes specifically with the mission, which is established on a supremacist, colonialist premise. And according to the vision of dharma, of vidya, of satya, of ahimsa, all of these ideas that we have, it's still a barbaric mindset. And so India is absolutely justified in rejecting people who want to export the same practices that they're apologizing for. There's one interesting thought that I'd share with you. If you have a think about this apology, so they have apologized over in Canada for what they were doing a long time ago. But when they were inflicting those horrors on the indigenous people, when those same missionaries came back to England, they didn't say, oh, this is what we've done. In England, the Anglican communion, the community of Christians who are part of the Church of England, they don't know what was done by this church. And yet they came back here, and the story they told the indigenous people of England was that, oh, there are these terrible natives out there. They're semi-barbarian, semi-devil, semi-man, and they have no souls, and we have to go and save their souls. And in fact, even killing them in the name of Christ is actually saving their soul, and perfectly valid. So there is an educational requirement to teach the British Anglican Communion of what was really done by their church when that church went out into the colonies. That's a fundamental requirement as well. We have to get the English people to understand what was done in their name, so that today's English people can also not feel the guilt of what was done in their name, and they can move forward as good people, as the vast majority of them are.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. Panditji, before we conclude this conversation, is there anything that you would like to suggest to the government of India, who should be, somebody would be receiving the Archbishop, and I'm sure he's going to meet some people in the government?
Yes, there is so much. Where do we start? Okay, firstly, I would suggest that any institution which is being investigated in its own country of origin by the government for abuses and bullying and discrimination, both on the basis of gender and on the basis of ethnic origin, any institution whose members are being investigated in that manner should not be allowed to send its emissaries into India. It's perfectly valid. If it was a corporation whose directors had been inflicting bullying, gender discrimination, race discrimination, as well as inflicting physical abuse on its employees, there is no way we would let that person who's the CEO come into the country and be greeted and regaled. And the Church of England is under investigation. There is something called IICSA, which is an independent inquiry into the multiple acts where the church chose to protect itself against the interests of the victims of its own pastors and its own priests. And so it's perfectly valid as a proposition to be able to say, we're very happy with other people of other denominations and traditions to come to our country, but this particular institution, while it's under investigation, no, we do not want their representatives to come here until they've been given a clean bill of health. So that would be the first thing that the Indian government, I think, is absolutely justified in doing. The second thing is, you mentioned that Justin Welby is going to be visiting Jallianwala Bagh. Now, symbolically, that is both the potential and for a huge opportunity of healing, but it's also the potential for the church to start to continue its missionary work in Punjab more than it ever has done before. And we don't want it to be the latter, it really must be the former. And if it were to be the former, I think there'd have to be an open acknowledgement that the white Anglican Christian who ordered Indians to shoot their own brethren, their brothers and sisters, unarmed children, mothers, daughters, and to shoot and continue shooting until there was no ammunition left, that he was acting completely in accordance with the teachings of the Church of England. And when he came back to England, he wasn't chastised, he was praised, he was honoured. A huge amount of money was gathered to give him a lovely pension. And so when Archbishop Welby, who From our dharmic perspective, the word right reverend is meaningless. It's a self-given title that the institution gives itself, And so we who adhere to principles of Vidya, Dharma, and Satya, right? It's meaningless to us. And so Justin Welby, when he stands there looking at Jallianwala Bagh, he should feel a sense of shame and remorse and genuinely say, this is something that was done with the blessing of my institution, and I am very unhappy at what was done. Now, if you were to come and say something along those lines, we could then open up the dialogue. Well, hang on, the principles that were applied at that time, aren't they the same principles that your institution is applying at this time? And so this conversation could then start, and it would genuinely pave the way to perhaps the formation of a council for reconciliation, for truth and reconciliation, where members of the dharmic communities, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, etc., all of whom suffered under the time of British occupation, all of them could actually engage in open dialogue with members of the Church of England and say, right, how do we move forward? I think that would be the second option. So one, there is no need at all for any missionaries to be allowed to come into India, none whatsoever. It's a colonialist relic, and much of what they're spreading, the West acknowledges as complete and utter baloney. I mean, in the UK, the attendance at Christian Church of England churches on a weekend has plummeted to less than 750,000 nationally, and that's the lowest it's ever been in history. And so people are abandoning this complete and utter fiction that they've been peddling in every corner of the world in the West at a vast rate. And so there is no reason why it should be accorded more respect in India just because of our principles of Atithi Devo Bhava and that misquoted, misunderstood principle of Sarva Dharma Sambhava. Christianity is not a dharma. It is something totally alien. And so we shouldn't be according them the same standards and the same respect that we actually accord to genuine, divinely inspired institutions and teachings.
Thank you very much, Satish ji, and we will have a hangout on Sarva Dharma Samabhava at a different time. But these are excellent thoughts, and let's hope that the Archbishop is listening, and this is the centenary year, and that would be a great time to start. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back with more such conversations.
Can I take the liberty of making one small request?
Oh, absolutely.
You have so many people who follow your channel and so many people who are so active on Twitter. Now, I think it would be wonderful if we were to try and get a message to an institution which has proven itself to be particularly hard of hearing when it comes to receiving such messages, if the Twitter sphere were to pick up certain hashtags, as they're called these days. We don't want any more white saviors. If I was mischievous, and as one of my younger students said to me, they suggested we should have a hashtag of white savior go home and things like this. But I would suggest that if the Twitter sphere around the PGurus community could keep an eye on what's going on Justin Welby's visit, bear in mind the subjects that we've talked about and the need for an apology and a council for reconciliation, and use their creativity to make sure that the message goes out loud and clear that India, the oldest civilization with the oldest religion it's universally acknowledged as being the motherland of divine teachings, we don't need white saviors anymore. What we do need is apologies.
And yes, we will be sure to track this. And thank you very much once again, Satish ji.
Absolute pleasure. It's an honor to be with you, and thank you for the wonderful work that PGurus does. A shout
Thank you
out
so
to
much.
you.
Thank you so much. Namaskar.